Hello and welcome to Exchanges for another week. Geopolitics, where does it sit in your spectrum? Not only that, why is the perception of them v us becoming such an ingrained psyche and political voter and political grabber in the current scenario? Those geopolitics are filtering into everything and anything that we see. So we need to have an exchange about why it's there. And do we need to actually have the ability to switch our view and understand the other side? We don't have to agree with it, but at least identify why they think the way they do. Merriden Varrall is the consulting lead for geopolitics at KPMG. She is also the CEO of Vantage Geopol, and she joins me today for Exchange to go through all this and more because this is her world. She's done a PhD in this space, and populism, as she's about to point out to you, is absolutely going to be the cornerstone of friction, but also the future of how we go forward. So this is my exchange with Merriden Varrall. Merriden Varrall, welcome to Exchanges. One of the big things that you have studied in depth, you now spend a lot of time consulting on, is the rise of populism and its almost inverse impact that it's having on markets, on business, and on trade. Why is populism now becoming protectionism? And why is it so attractive to the general populace despite its impact in terms of what it can do long term?
Thank you so much for having me, Evan. This is such a fascinating topic, and I'm really pleased to have the chance to talk about it with you in some depth, because I think it's something that it's sort of skirting around the edges of people's minds. You know, you see headlines about what's going on with populism or political movements around the world, but I don't think it's something that's well understood by Australian businesses and in what's going on and why it matters to them, and also, you know, what they can do about it. So maybe we can start with, you know, the questions that you just asked me cover a fair bit of ground. So maybe, what do you reckon if we start with thinking a little bit about what populism actually is? Because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about that. And a lot of people think that it's, you know, kind of some extreme leftism or some extreme rightism. And interestingly, it's neither of those things, right? It can be left, it can be right. And we've seen over the years that it was very left for a long time. But since the 90s, we've seen whatever populism has been growing has been much more on the right side of things. So what isn't populism to start with? It's not left, it's not right. It's not about a set of particular policy approaches that all populist leaders follow or believe in. So if we flip that then over, what is it? It's an approach to relating to the people. And it's an approach to understanding the existing systems of power. So what it is it's really anti-establishment. It's about a leader coming in and saying, this whole system, all of these institutions, all of these elites that we know and that have been governing us, they're rubbish. They're corrupt, they're inept, they're incompetent, they're not working for us. And so it's really fundamentally anti-establishment. Another thing that is a key tenet of populism is it's really about an us and them mentality, that we're protecting us, we the people as it were, from some threatening other. And the great thing about populism is that you can define and create your own other to fit your own circumstances. So it's not always foreigners, it's not always immigrants, it's not always X or Y. You can shape that. But the themes are always anti-establishment and this sense of us and them. So when you have a populist leader or a populist kind of growth in the political landscape, it's because there is this opportunity where the people in the country are feeling marginalized. They're feeling like they're not keeping up with what they should be keeping up with. They feel like institutions aren't working for them. There's a whole lot of mistrust. And the Edelman Trust Barometer shows year after year after year around the world, mistrust in institutions is growing. So along comes this really charismatic leader who says, I also don't trust institutions. I also believe that the establishment is rubbish and they're letting us down. I believe that I am one of you and we can break this together. We can make our country a better place. And so you have then, as I said, not neither left nor right, but you have this combination of charismatic leader who also doesn't trust, who also thinks that we are greater than the institutions. And what they then do is domestically, they start to undermine the checks and balances on democratic power, because they say those have been put in place to hold you in check, to hold me in check. And we don't need those because we are all the people. And you start to see the erosion of the judiciary, the media, freedom of speech, all of these kinds of things that were deliberately put in place to hold back executive power. You see increasing immigration controls, you see domestic industrial subsidies, you see the increasing use of economic and trade tools like tariffs, and you do start to see often the exacerbation of social polarization because this us and them thing that's so integral to populism. We are us and the others are the problem, and we're going to stick in
Mhm.
our bubble and we're going to mistrust the others. So that polarization increases. Internationally, populist leaders, sorry, I know I'm going on a bit, but just quickly,
No, 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 go for it.
internationally, that us and them, us versus them thing comes out as well. So it's all about the nation state. It's all about our country. And so we don't trust international institutions. We don't trust multilateralism. We're skeptical of openness. We're skeptical of trade negotiations. We're skeptical of the WTO because we think that that is a vulnerability, that they're going to try and weaken us. So instead, we're very much more about this kind of zero-sum us against everybody else. So there's really big implications for what populism does both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, because okay, that's brilliant. Because I want to go back on the history there. So
Yep,
you clearly have hit on globalization, right? So
yep,
globalization pretty much started at the end of the 70s or even
yep.
midway through the 70s, and what it has done to trade. And there, you've also then talked about. I love that concept that it's you are losing something. When did we feel like we are losing out? Because this is the other part of the whole discussion is that they're doing better than me or they're going to get ahead of me. So it all comes down to the glory of protectionism. And we know that the catch with what we've just discussed, the rise of globalism, the rise of free trade has led to some of the largest increases in living standards in basically economic history. Yet protectionism now is becoming the fundamental thought process going forward. So, are we seeing the death of globalism? Are we seeing not just a resurgence in protectionism, but a different type of protectionism that will end up leading to a lowering of living standards as populism becomes more and more the political standard rather than the political extreme?
So if you start to think about globalism and globalization, this is one of the key reasons why, as you say, that populism has been rising over the past um, 10 or 15 years in particular. So as you say, it really
Mhm.
kicked off that project in the 70s. And it was about 20 years ago that Joseph Stiglitz wrote his book, Globalization and Its Discontents, right? He was the former World Bank chief economist. He was a Nobel laureate for his work. And he said, you know, globalism has failed to deliver broad prosperity. So yes, it's lifted a bunch of people out of poverty, but it hasn't been even. There's been a whole lot of losers as well. And that gap between the winners and losers is growing. And then more
Can I just jump in
recently,
there?
yes, please.
Is that losers group, which is this is the other thing that's interesting about what we're talking about here, because it's almost like battles and wars in the fact that the
Mm,
victor gets to write the script, and the
mm.
losers at the moment feel like the developed nations like the US, like Europe, like Australia, where growth has not moved at the same rate or change as we've seen in places like Asia or South America. Is this also why populism is becoming quite fascinating? Because nations that previously, inverted commas, won now feel like they're not getting ahead against countries that are coming up quickly behind them that have possibly been losers in the past.
The way that globalization exacerbates inequality is both between and across countries as well as within countries. So
Okay.
yes, we've seen, what people would describe as the Asian miracle, where Asian countries have been growing at double digits and Western countries have been growing 3%, maybe if they're having a good year. So
Mhm.
there's a perception that something ain't right there, but it's more the kind of the dislocation within countries that's driving the populism that we're seeing at the moment. And this sense that, and it's important to notice, I think, that it's a perception as much as a fact, right? That people feel like they've been left behind, and stats may or may not support that, right? But people sure feel like there's been this whole big compromise to be more globally interconnected. And someone's getting the cash, someone's getting wealthier, but it isn't my real wages have stagnated. I mean, this is a huge issue in the US, for example. I'm not getting ahead, but I can see a whole layer of people up there who are looking really, licking the cream off their lips. They're looking very happy. And I feel resentful about that. I don't trust them. So it's that perception, and it can be real or it can just be perceived, of inequality within societies that really drives this sense of mistrust, that we're losing, that the elites are to blame, that the elites' mismanagement or corruption are to blame for my circumstances. And so people start to then look for scapegoats. They start to believe that it's the institutions and it's the elite, but they also start to believe that it's other people in society. Someone else is the cause of this problem. Often it ends up being a perception that foreign workers or immigrants are the cause of the problem. The old cliche that they're taking our jobs, and so that creates this fertile ground for the us and them. So
Mhm.
when we had the GFC in 2008, and when we had COVID, these really intensified that economic inequality that people were feeling, and that really was part of, but not the entire reason that populism became. We've been seeing such a spike in it over the past 10 or 15 years. But what economic discontent drives, which is a category in itself as well, is this kind of cultural anxiety as well. So when you have this economic discontent at the same time as cultural anxiety, rapidly shifting norms, rapid social change, people feeling alienated from society, from mainstream politics, then again, populism is really resonant, because a populist leader comes in and says, I understand how you feel. None of this represents us, does it? We don't feel like we're part of this system anymore. What we need to do is recreate the system so that that it represents us, so that it's good for us. And people want to hear that meets their needs. So when you have those two things together, and then the third component, a digital social media environment, which
Mhm.
allows the messaging to skip past traditional kind of media gatekeepers, to get directly into people's inboxes, into people's minds, and the way in which algorithms deliberately are designed to promote material that is more sensational, more exciting in this attention economy, and you get more of the same kinds of information. It creates those truth bubbles, and it also creates and perpetuates social isolation, and the division and polarization of society. So these three things together really have created, over the past 10 to 15 years, a perfect storm: intensified public dissatisfaction and discontent, mistrusted institutions, the judiciary, the mainstream media considered to be biased or working for the powerful, and not for us. And you see this really fundamental reshaping of politics and social and economic landscape.
So how does the institutions, inverted commas, come back from this? Like, let's go a little bit broad to
Yeah.
start with. NATO, UN, WTO, right? They're the three that you've highlighted that clearly at the moment, geopolitically, you can see, particularly out of the US, are facing the most amount of pressure. There's always been an argument that A, they're toothless, B, they don't have the right level of spending on, depending on which nations are which, and also that they are becoming ideological themselves, depending on which side of populism you want to sit. How do they regain or, you know, evolve in the rise of populism? And that is clearly going to be part of the politic going into the next several decades.
Yeah, I mean, that's a profound and important question, right? How do we try to reverse this? Can we reverse this?
Hmm.
Is it too far
Yeah,
gone? And the institutions are both the international institutions that you mentioned, but also the domestic institutions. And in a way,
I was coming to them.
okay, in a way,
Yeah,
it's the same issue that besets both of them. It's lack of trust, it's perceived inadequacy, toothless, etc. As you said, what are they good for? And so institutional reform is an obvious one. Um, trying to build trust again, trying to demonstrate value and utility in institutions, and again, both domestic and international. But that's really hard, particularly because we're in this geopolitical environment of competition and mistrust. In the international realm, You don't have NATO countries or G7 countries or WTO countries sitting down and having a nice, culturally appropriate drink of choice and saying, let's work this out, shall we? Let's put our own individual interests aside and let's sort this out for the greater good, because that is exactly the opposite of the mentality that populist leaders and world leaders more generally are feeling right now. Right now, it's hunker down, batten down the hatches. What can we do to protect ourselves in this volatile global geopolitical landscape? It's not about how do we cooperate, how do we do this for the greater good. It's a very difficult conundrum because the ball just keeps on rolling.
Then the domestic question is, you've got federal politics, you've got state politics, you've got institutions like the Reserve Bank of Australia, which has been obviously under that question around quality. Firstly, the states are my first question for you, is that we saw during COVID that the states actually have more power, inverted commas, than they realize with what they could do around borders. But also the disconnect between the 7 or 8 of them, depending on how you want to include the territories, where they sit into the future of that, but also how Australia fits in populism, because we are seeing it not at the levels that we're seeing in Europe and in the US, but here it's coming as well. How do we reverse that, but also, as I said, that the relationship with the states and the territories, the relationships with Canberra, the relationships with things like the Reserve Bank of Australia, where does that all play at the moment as well?
All right, well, let's think about that kind of state um, situation first. And again, it's a matter for being able to cooperate. It's a matter for our politicians to be able to say, right, what is the greater good here, and how can we all pull together? And when we have small p politics and people trying to score points for short-term political gain, that makes that very difficult. So there's an issue here, as there always has been, about the quality of our leaders and our politicians. What are they putting
Mhm.
first here? The greater good, the larger public interest, or short-term political gains? And we have to somehow try and ensure that our politics is about longer-term, greater public good. And that's something that has always been true, right? But it's possibly even more critically important now. Then you were asking about how Australia fits into populism. So it's a broader global trend, this, and the sorts of pushes and challenges that are leading to the rise of populist influence around the world are true in Australia as well. But we have, as our recent report sort of sets out, we have institutions in Australia, for example, compulsory voting, mandatory voting, that help us manage the extremes more productively, more effectively than in other countries. So we know that in Australia, for example, in 2024, the Edelman Trust Barometer shows that 52% of respondents don't trust political institutions. So that's a lot of people. Pleasingly,
It's a
that's
lot.
gone up from 48% in 2023. So something good happened that year that helped cheer people up a bit. But around about half of Australians respondents are concerned that politicians are deliberately misleading them. So we have a problem too that we need to make sure that we're not complacent about. And we talked about this in our top risks report that we put out last year. But that's Edelman Trust Barometer stuff. That's all public research. So we do have a challenge in Australia, and we can't be complacent. And if I can take that to a crossover to so what for business.
Mhm.
Interestingly, the Edelman Trust Barometer talks about how government in Australia is seen as far less competent and ethical than business. Business is seen as being able to fill this gap in trust, in competence and ethics. Now, that's a huge opportunity for business to be able to play a rather different role than it has traditionally played in strengthening institutions and building the kind of trust that we need if we want to push back against populism. So there's a whole new and different role for business here that traditionally I think businesses have been a bit wary of going anywhere near politics and being involved. But research shows us that people expect it and people think that there's a role that business should play. So there's a really interesting opportunity there, I think, for business to step into that. But it's also a risk, right? Because you could get it wrong if you don't do it
Yeah.
carefully.
So is that because business leaders now have perception of having leadership that is possibly stronger than politicians. I mean, again, there's always been this argument around the quality of leader is obviously the quality of payment. I mean, again, Australian politics is quite heavily well paid compared to our peers overseas, but the perception is that it's not, and therefore the quality leadership ends up in business and ends up in consulting, where you are getting the really big money rather than the lower money. Is that where maybe it also sits in a perception world as well? If you are looking at a CEO of a bank or of a mining company in this country versus a state premier or a backbencher, that the leadership is more respected because they've got there through a different work, and therefore they're respected because of the finances that they're remunerated with.
I don't really know the answer to that, to be honest.
Yeah, a
Um,
fair call.
I don't know what remuneration, how that pushes into the quality of leadership. But what what we can say, I think, is that the research shows us that business has an opportunity here.
I then want to pivot back to what we started talking about at the start, which is around protectionism.
Yep.
Tariffs obviously are back in vogue with
Yep.
what the president of the United States is now doing. We are seeing that possibly also coming out of from Beijing. We know that Europe has been doing it by stealth for quite a long time. Is tariffs going to be the deal going forward? Are we going to have to go back to the 50s, 60s, and early 70s where protectionism was absolutely core to people's economic beliefs? And where does Australia sit in that? Because we are still very much strong on the idea that we need free international trade. We are resisting calls to go down the tariff route. Where does this all play out from here?
I reckon this is one of the most interesting phenomenons the past 5 or 10 years, and it's absolutely correlated with this rise in populism, because as we try to protect our nation state above all else from this worrying and alarming other, we start to use all tools rather than just your sort of standard diplomatic tools. We start to see trade and economics and investment being used as tools of power too, and that's extraordinary in ways that, as you say, we haven't seen for decades.
Hmm.
And and we used to think it was, inverted commas, them who are using tariffs and economic coercion to try and maintain, or try to gain political advantage. It was always, that other country. But now we see countries that we consider to be in our own um, shared network or shared set of values absolutely using these kind of economic and investment tools of economic coercion. Um, and I think the short answer to your question is yes, we're going to see more of it. It's very hard to imagine a world in which someone says, "Hey, we're not going to do that because we don't think it's right, and we're just going to get slaughtered. That'll be fine." Everybody is getting bit by bit increasingly involved in this kind of um, tariff. I think there's grades. You start off with using these economic tools, and then it builds towards something that you could describe as serious protectionism. I don't think Australia's in
Hmm.
the serious protectionism space just yet, because also protectionism has an understanding to it that, like, there is no economic logic here. This is entirely geopolitical logic. We're not at that stage yet, but other countries in the world are, and we have taken some steps into that direction. But for Australia, as you were asking, we're a small, exposed trading nation. Our prosperity depends on a free and fair and open and stable global system. Our leaders, Penny Wong says this all the time. This is what we need. Now, that's not what we're going to get. That's not where things are heading. And as you pointed out, these kinds of things like tariffs and protectionism, that is where things are heading. Can we do something to try and slow it down? Can businesses try to do something about it? Yes, I think we can do more than we have been. But is this something that's more or less outside of our control? Do we have to also imagine a world in which we just have to navigate this reality? Yes, we do. And we have to start doing things at the same time as trying to build ourselves as a place of institutional trust. We also have to recognize that we may have to be working in a world that is very different from the past several decades, in terms of the way in which economics is
So
understood.
does that so does that explain why, the federal government obviously is inverted commas investing in areas like solar manufacturing, in quantum computing. I mean, that is a form of protectionism in itself, obviously government intervention. We've also seen it with the jumping in of saving smelters across the country as well. There's an argument that's been had at the moment, though, that we're doing this ad hoc. If we are going to go down this route of economic intervention rather than let's calling it protectionism and tariffs, do we need to therefore talk about, if this is the future, where we actually have frameworks and layouts about how and what projects get that assistance, that get that inverted commas government backup that at the moment appears not to be there? It's almost on an ad hoc basis.
Yeah, well, this then gets into this idea of picking winners, right?
Yeah.
And people always say picking winners is a terrible idea. It'll never work. And from an economic perspective, that's quite true, right? It's not
Hmm.
easy to pick winners. You don't know exactly where things are going to go. But if you're in a landscape where geopolitical logic is becoming more um, influential, then picking winners takes a whole different tone. And you're starting to think about things from a critical and strategic perspective rather than the kind of economic logic perspective, in which case making sure that you have sovereign capability in critical things like smelting steel, yeah, that's a good idea, because we'll need that. But it's just we just sort of have to understand it as an entirely different logic, and it's not an economic logic. Um,
Hmm.
we had the reform of the SOCI Act, and in the reform of the SOCI Act, we expanded our definition of what is a critical infrastructure, critical industry, from a small number to a much, much bigger number. And now, groceries are included as a critical sector. So the definition of criticality and strategic keeps expanding. What keeps going into that bucket keeps growing. And it's not about what makes economic sense. It's about what makes strategic sense. What can we not trust others to give to us that we need? And when we talk about things like critical minerals, for example, that definition of critical, it's entirely subjective. Every country has their own definition of what is a critical mineral. It has nothing to do
Hmm.
with the essence of the mineral itself. It's just, do we need it, and is it at risk? And so when we look at things through that perspective, all sorts of things are critical, and the government is going to start investing or continuing to invest in those areas, even if it doesn't make economic logic to, inverted commas, pick those winners.
The follow on from that is that, could you see a future where maybe there's a change of government or a change of thought process as leader, where those critical minerals that we supply, whether that's soft agriculture, whether that's hard minerals, etc., that we withhold, similar to what we're seeing in the debate right now with rare earths, similar to what we're seeing with things like gold? Could Australia enter into that kind of protectionism where we actually withhold the critical minerals that we export to keep it in house?
It's hard to see that being something that Australia would do, but of course it's not impossible. Um,
Because gas is the other one, right? So gas right
yeah,
now is the other
right.
debate.
Yeah,
Uh,
we've got some stuff that other countries really need.
mhm,
But if I think about the broader long-term strategy, it would be foolhardy for Australia to damage our reputation as a reliable supplier, because right now the world is looking for reliability and security and trustworthiness, right? And we've not
mhm.
only got the stuff, we've also got a good reputation. There's other people who have the stuff too, but if they don't have a good reputation, Australia will be the source of choice increasingly as geopolitical volatility increases. So it is to our strategic advantage to remain a trustworthy supplier, because that makes us different from competitors.
Final one to look at with this whole protectionism thing. We have a Victorian state election coming up in 2026. We have a federal election coming up in 2028. Do you see necessity changing the way that our politics is going? Because most people would point out at the moment that our politicians of all colours and persuasion are becoming quite conservative, even if they're on the left, in terms of actually making choice. They're also arguing the point that until they take it to the people, they can't act. is there anything that you think with what's happening right now that will actually move the dial to get away from this conservative politic action that we currently find ourselves in before the upcoming elections that we've got?
I'm probably not, that's a little bit outside my area of research and expertise. But what I would say is that, going back to that earlier point about the institutions that we've got helping us
Hmm.
to smooth out the extremities, right? So
Yep.
if we're going a little bit in one direction, things like our mandatory voting means that the likelihood is that it will balance out. So we're in a fortunate position there. But again, going back to that earlier point I was making before, there is an extent to which all of that is outside the control of business actors. And what we have to do is really understand what is going on, really understand the risks and the opportunities that are arising from this, and be very, very astute in the way that we think about our strategy and our operations going forward from here, because we will not be able to be future proofing. We will not be able to have sort of anti-fragility capability, as I saw in the AICD journal this month, unless we do, because this
Yeah.
stuff is changing and we can't control it.
Final question that I ask all guests on exchanges. Merriden Varrall, if you're in charge for just one day, what would you do?
That makes me think about when I was in year 6 and I was running for school captain. I'm like,
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
have free chocolate for everybody. No more uniforms. Does that count? Can I answer
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, you can answer that. Absolutely.
As a grown up, although those things are still really important to me, if I was in charge and I could do anything for just one day, I've always wanted to better understand how other people see the world. I did my PhD in political anthropology because we grow up in a socialized environment like everybody does, right? And we see the world the way we see the world, and we think that's right.
Mhm.
But not everybody sees the world that way. And that is why we have these complexities and these challenges and these tensions, is because of an inability to really empathize, or at least sympathize with people who see things another way. And one of the things that I studied China a lot, and one of the things I found really extraordinary about that was we so often interpret China or construct China through our own lens. And I couldn't say that after many years of studying China that I understood it, but I understand that it's not how we construct it from here. So if I was in charge for one day, I would like to give everybody the opportunity to genuinely understand where others are coming from. You don't have to
Mhm.
believe it, you don't have to agree with it, but just to get it and to think, that's not how I see it, but that's how they see it. Because I think that could make a bit of a difference in personal
I would
relationships, in global politics.
I would argue that would be a huge advantage for all and sundry if you can understand why conflict happens. That's basically what you're saying there, is that understand the view of the conflict that's occurred.
Yeah.
Because
And
you're right.
I really don't think that means you have to agree, right? Like, if I
Yeah, you don't have
understand
to.
Putin's point of view, it doesn't make me go, yeah, top idea.
Yeah,
But it can help me
understand it.
address it better if
Yep.
that's what the direction is that we're going in. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic answer. Merriden Varrall, thank you so much for joining Exchanges.
Thank you so much for having me, Evan.
Big thanks to Merriden for coming on. Her last point, I think, is absolutely key. We need to have the ability to see the other side. Don't have to agree with it, don't have to like it, but we definitely need to understand it. And that, I think, is an absolute key takeout of what this entire exchange was about. So thank you to Merriden for coming on. An absolute pleasure to have you here. To you out there, as always, thank you for watching, listening, or viewing wherever it is that you get this podcast. We love having you part of the Exchanges crew. If you do have any ideas, thoughts, or guests that you'd like me to get on, we do have the email exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. Until next week, thank you as always. I'll speak to you then, and have a great time indeed.